Very early on, when John Cook starts to speak, Charles taps his shoulder to stop him. The silver head of his cane drops off and rolls to the floor. And it's such a symbolic moment at that point that Charles, in his chair, is waiting for somebody to retrieve it. The court comes to a halt, but I think everybody's waiting to see what actually is going to happen here. And in the end, Charles stoops, picks the silver head up, and Cook continues.
Hello and welcome to this week's pod. My name's Oliver Webb-Carter and I'm the editor and your host. Today I welcome back friend of the show Mark Turnbull to talk about the trial and execution of Charles I. Now I had originally planned to deal with both the trial and execution in one episode, but we chatted for so long I've separated them into two, with today the trial and on Tuesday, as a bonus podcast, the execution. We'll then be back on track with the regular schedule next Saturday when I speak with Saul David about Zulu, his book on the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, which began in January of that year. So we've got two anniversaries here. The trial of Charles was without precedent, and that was part of the problem. The Rump Parliament of 1649, those MPs remaining who were bent on punishing the king for the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, aka the English Civil Wars, chose to try the king. In my chat with Mark, we talk about why both the existence of the court as well as the prosecution was so problematic and therefore difficult to pin anything on Charles. We also chat about the part played by the king. Up until this huge event, Charles had been pretty hopeless. And as you may have heard from my recent talk with Leander de Lisle, his wife Henrietta Maria was far more competent. But it was the trial when he finally showed what he could have been. Mark Turnbull is an author and historian and currently writing a biography of Charles, so we're in good hands. Coming up on Tuesday, we'll be talking about the execution. So there's a spoiler for you. Charles does indeed get his head chopped off. All this took place between the 20th and 30th of January, so anniversary right now. Please do subscribe and you'll get episodes added to your feed. Coming up, as I said, I've got Saul David on the Zulu War, Gary Sheffield on World War I, John Sayles on 18th century Scotland and America, and much, much more. If you can rate or review, that would be great. But in the meantime, I'll hand you over to me speaking with Mark Turnbull. Mark Turnbull, welcome back to the podcast. It's great to speak to you again. And today we're talking about the trial and the execution of King Charles I.
Hi, Ollie. Yeah, looking forward to talking to you again. It's great to catch up.
It certainly is. We're at the anniversary. It was in 1649 that this occurred. Now, it's great that the listeners get to hear from you, because not only have you written novels about the period, and we spoke briefly. We had a good chat last year, talking about Charles I, and that was in the context of your trilogy of novels, the latest of which was the King's Cavalier. But you've just been telling me about your new history book, Charles I's Private Life, and this means that it's a real, we're very lucky to have someone who's got a new history of Charles I coming on to talk about. Probably, now I'm going to say something you may disagree with, but probably the final week or so of his life, when he actually performed admirably as a king, in contrast to his earlier life, which is of course the trial and the execution.
Yeah, I think it was his finest performance. I don't think it was. I think when you look at his role as king, I think it's definitely, there's areas that he didn't perform well in, but there are areas that he really did perform quite well in, and definitely the trial and the execution were starring.
Good stuff. Well, let's start. I think the trial began, on the 20th of January, 1649, and we're coming off the back of, or rather, this is within the control of the Rump
Parliament. So I thought we could just start talking, just to give the listeners a bit of background. Obviously, we've had the civil wars. It would just be good to understand. We've got the civil wars have ended. Charles has been carrying on negotiating with enemies of Parliament, and Parliament has decided enough's enough, hasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you've got not only the Civil War of 16 that broke out officially in 1642, and Charles surrendered himself in 1646. There was the uprisings, which is called the Second Civil War in 1648. So he's been militarily defeated twice. The period between the end of the first conflict and the second conflict, during that time, Charles is a captive. He's first held by the Scots. He surrenders to the Scots at first. He's then transferred into English ownership. Some say in exchange for a wad of money. And then at that moment, there's approaches to Charles from all different angles. So everybody is looking for a settlement that works for them. So you've got Charles who has got to the point where he has some clear red lines that he's not going to cross in terms of the Church of England. You've got the Scots who, although they've handed him over to the English, they are by no means done. The Scots do not want any procedure against the king. They don't want him off the throne in comparison to a lot of the English parliamentarians. So the Scots are continuously looking for a resolution, for a deal. The English Parliament have their own terms that they present to him. The New Model Army are actually then get to the point where they present terms. Now, Charles, in the middle of this, has, as I say, his own set of principles. He's got his family telling him, what to give up and, to agree to terms. The Queen at one point says, just agree to everything. But I think in one measure of Charles, it says a lot that he didn't just ever agree to everything that was put before him with the intention of reneging on that. He never did agree to the ultimate reforms that were requested about the church. So it was a very, very difficult time, if you like. It was still a period of warfare over the peace. When I was researching the biography, that I think is really underdone. We don't realize just how much Charles gave up from the period of, say, 1641 right through the civil wars to that point where he's in captivity. He gave up quite a lot. For example, often officially in Parliament from the throne, agreeing, for example, that Parliament should meet every 3 years. These prerogative powers, he'd given them up then. And to that point in captivity, that's when he was at a point where he felt that he couldn't, in conscience, give up anymore. But he did actually move again. So, for example, the control of the militia, he'd never formally agreed to give that up. But in captivity, he was willing to negotiate on that and say that he would do it for perhaps 10 years. Then there was talk that he would give it up entirely if that would be given back to his son after his death. So there was still some maneuvering that he was willing to do, but there was certainly less movement for him. And I think that's when he was looking for the best deal. That's when the accusations can be leveled that he was playing one side against another, which he was. But at the same time, all of these other factions were hoping to get one over the others by using Charles.
So how do we get to the first day of trial which was on the 20th of January?
So there was a definite step change that brought that about. And first and foremost, at the end of 1647, the Scots, as I'd said, had been continually approaching the king, offering military support. The New Model Army had offered to support him. Parliament had their own terms, which weren't particularly, good for Charles. The best terms, ironically, for Charles would have been the armies, but really for him, they had no legitimate power to present those terms. So if he accepted those, it would be a sign of the power of the sword going above the power of Parliament, for example, a legitimate Parliament. So Charles eventually agrees with the Scots. Okay, I'll make a deal with you. You support me militarily in exchange for Charles agreeing to Presbyterianism, to establish Presbyterianism in England, perhaps for some sort of limited term. And in the end, that causes a Scottish army to eventually, and I say eventually because it took them quite some time, to cross the border in his support. And that coincides with a lot of the uprisings in 1648 that Parliament had to deal with and the New Model Army. So the Scots was only one aspect of that, but it was perhaps the biggest threat.
And that is interesting because obviously for nowadays we view Scotland as part of the Union, and whilst it's a separate country, we're all united. In 1649, Scotland's a foreign country, effectively, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The thing that binds it together is Charles and the Stuart monarchy. But that's the thing. This is why throughout all of the end game of the Civil War and the trial and the execution, Scottish leaders were continually supporting. I should rephrase that. They were continuously disagreeing with any sort of trial, removal, and certainly any sort of threat to Charles's life, because Charles was one of their people to them. They saw the fact that they've got a Scottish-born king on the English throne, that gave them the heads up. And they just probably feared that if he was removed, who would be the replacement, and would that lessen Scotland's authority and influence?
And is he, when Scotland invades, is he under the custody of Colonel Whalley at this stage, who listeners may remember? I've discussed him with Robert Harris, who's written a very good novel about Whalley and his in-law. I forget his son-in-law's name, actually. But is he under the custody of Whalley at this stage?
So that's just afterwards. So what happens is Charles is he is initially taken from the Scots and kept in captivity by parliamentarian commissioners and army, a small force. The New Model Army, there's a breakaway element of the New Model Army who kidnap him and take him from Parliament's control into the army. And they hope to do a separate deal. Again, just the New Model Army is comprised of independents who are much more against a state church. They want more freedom of worship for sects. Charles, obviously, I've mentioned that he can't do a deal with the army, which, because that just goes against the whole principle that he's standing for. And eventually he is taken to Hampton Court, where Colonel Whalley is the governor. And he is dealt with remarkably well. The army treat him very well. Whalley is very respectful. He even thanks Whalley at the point when he escapes for the way that he's treated. It's almost like a mini court again, so he's allowed to see his children. He's being painted while in captivity. Artists are there. He's allowed to see friends. A lot of the court formality is restored, which wasn't there in parliamentarian captivity. And then he escapes from Hampton Court, concerned about a threat to his life from leveller/radical Republican elements. The army risks being split. You've got the element led by Fairfax and Cromwell, who don't want radical outcomes. They certainly don't support the levellers' calls for votes for all men over 21, things like that.
Outrageous demands like that.
Yeah, that's it. So, and then you've got the other element of the New Model Army, which is more militant, who are pushing for a trial execution even, calling Charles that man of blood. And at the point when the Scots invade, Charles is in Carisbrooke. He's fled Hampton Court and Colonel Whalley. He actually ends up in Carisbrooke.
And roughly when are we at this stage?
It was 1647. It was at the end of 1647 when he escapes Hampton Court and Whalley and goes to Carisbrooke. The governor of Carisbrooke, Whalley and the governor of Carisbrooke, Robert Hammond, are both relatives of Cromwell. And really, he's gone from the frying pan into the fire. He's on an island. It's easier to pin him down. Hammond, he thinks, might be friendly because he's a relative of Charles's chaplain, but actually he's also a relative of a New Model Army colonel. So yeah, it doesn't turn out the way that he thinks. And Hammond is, on the face of it, loyal to, he's an army officer, but he is loyal to Parliament. And when it comes to the crunch, Hammond takes his orders from Parliament over the New Model Army. Okay, and that leads to another severance.
I see, right. So then Parliament, tell me if I'm jumping ahead here, but Parliament over Christmas and then into January is deciding what to do with Charles, and then around I think it's New Year's Day, they start sidelining the House of Lords, who are sympathetic to the king, and therefore this is where you get the Rump Parliament, and they decide they're going to put Charles on trial.
Yeah, so end of 1647, he's in Carisbrooke. At that point, Parliament have had enough. They are not willing to negotiate. They know that the Scots, it's not a big secret that the Scots are, giving him terms. It's not a big secret that he is tempted by those terms. And Parliament really sit tight and prepare to see what happens. They then deal with the uprisings. The Scots enter with an army. They are systematically crushed and defeated. Cromwell goes up to Preston. So Charles he faces that second military defeat after the Scots are vanquished. And then at that point, when you think that he should be at his lowest ebb, Parliament begin to reopen negotiations. However, it's not easy. So what they do is they allow him to have his chaplains back around him. They agree that they're going to give him a certain amount of time to negotiate with them over their propositions. Propositions are not particularly the best ones. They don't really change their stance, Parliament. And Charles is pinned down. So in the Isle of Wight, he's in Newport. He spends day after day meeting these commissioners, but it's not a verbal negotiation. So these commissioners are tightly controlled by Westminster. They are given criteria and points that they've got to go through with the king. Exchanges of written papers happen between the king and his councillors and the parliamentarian commissioners. They address every aspect and report back to Westminster, and only when Westminster are content with the king's reply do they agree to that point and move on to the next. So it's such a fine-tooth comb that Charles goes through these. He compares himself at that point to a commander in a besieged house, and says he's going to make some of the stone walls his tombstone. But he does ultimately give way on a lot of points. This is the point when Charles gives way on more than he has ever done, and he ends up apologizing to his son for that. But it does get him to the point where Parliament agree, okay, you haven't granted everything, but you've made sufficient concessions for us to invite you to London, talk about giving you an income again, and re-establishing you on the throne. All along at this point, the New Model Army are looking on and watching and thinking to themselves, well, hang on a minute, there's going to be no room for us independents. We're not going to see a change in constitution or government here. The king will be re-established in a hollow, as a shadow of his former self, but who will be in charge? Certainly not them. They protest along the way, and then in the end, the army take matters into their own hands, and they follow through on earlier threats they'd made, and they eventually purge Parliament. So they head to Westminster.
And when you say they, where's Cromwell in all this?
That's $1 million question. So, like everything with Cromwell, he stays in the shadows when crucial, critical, divisive moments present themselves. You've got his family, his close associates that are more prominent in the dealings, but nobody necessarily knows what Cromwell's truly thinking. Letters, for example, are coded. There's aliases used. I've seen letters that Cromwell has written in archives, and there is a clear reference that Cromwell is aware that there is a chance that Parliament will be purged, and he's not in disagreement with that. But I think what he's looking for is, does it have to be right now? Does it have to be a purge? Do we just have another election? So I don't think he's closed off. Certainly he never speaks out, and I think that's a telling thing for Cromwell. The type of person that he was, he wasn't afraid of speaking out if he would disagree with something, or if he believed that God would disagree with that. And these were his closest associates. He's only in Yorkshire. Yes, it's towards the end of the year, bad weather, but he is a cavalry commander. He will have good cavalry troops that could ride to London with messages if needed. But yeah, the face of the purge is handled by, again, a minor army official, so a minor army officer, Colonel Pride. And Pride takes Parliament by surprise and turns away a large number of MPs, imprisons some other ones, and really hundreds of MPs then are excluded in one way or the other. And the remainder, the rump, are the MPs who are more militant, more independent, and sympathise with the army. And then immediately, the negotiations and the invitation for Charles to come to London are ended, and the New Model Army land on the Isle of Wight and take control of the King's person. They arrest Robert Hammond, the governor, and from that point, Charles is under control of the army.
And that's really when he is going to be put on trial, because, as you say, the Rump Parliament, that's the desire of these more extreme elements of Parliament. The House of Lords are out of the way. Right.
Yeah, so at that point, House of Lords is still there. However, the Rump MPs that are left bring in an intention to try the king. They pass a motion to set up a High Court of Justice. The Lords tries to stop that. They try to adjourn, and say that in the hope, naive hope really, that if they are absent, nothing can proceed. And that's when the House of Commons says, we are the voice of the people. We can do whatever we please. If we pass it, it's passed. It no longer needs the House of Lords.
Okay, so this is the early days of 1649, of January 1649, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah.
So we have the High Court of Justice, which is this is the trial of the king. So what's Charles? Does Charles discuss a strategy with anyone before he goes in, or is this sort of he's in isolation, so he's really has only himself as counsel?
He is, yeah. So he is in isolation at that point, so that there isn't anyone really that he can talk to. He probably knows well enough the Queen's opinions. They both have clashed before then over it. It was a particular low point for Charles that the Queen didn't seem to agree or understand his conscience about what he would agree to. And Edward Hyde, said himself that when the king's isolated and left to his own devices, he's often quite his best advisor. He is his own best advisor. And at that point, I think, personally speaking, I think that Charles gets to the point where he thinks that perhaps he has displeased God enough, to the point where he thinks, well, perhaps it is best that I do go, and if I stand fast for these principles, if it does end in my execution, then that's God's will, and that's God's judgment. I'll take that if it means that my son regains the throne with the prerogative powers that I'd lost.
So these principles, which I guess are the argument, it's really the argument that he makes at the trial, in the first day or so of the trial, where he refuses to even accept the authority of the court, because as sovereign he is the ultimate authority. So how can the court take that authority from him with no act of parliament and no legal basis?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a masterstroke in a way. It's the best of a bad situation. And really, you've got, on the one hand, you've got people that say that's just Charles being stubborn, not willing to compromise. How dare he, question the court when he's before it? But on the other end of the spectrum, that's him as well, potentially thinking, well, I'm before this power, which is what he called them. If he gives his, if he pleads, then he's acknowledging their authority. But it's beyond that. He's actually acknowledging the authority of that Rump Parliament. He's acknowledging the authority of the army purging that. He's really rubber stamping a absolutely unprecedented, non-constitutional act, which goes against his duties as a monarch as well. So he can't really plead, but at the same time he's in a quandary, because he does try and play the court and use a bit of a card by saying, let me speak to the full Houses of Parliament, Lords and Commons assembled, with the excluded members, because he really knows deep down that potentially might get him somewhere. And of course,
because the House of Lords would be sympathetic to him, wouldn't they? As with those MPs who've been pushed out.
That's it, yeah. And all along, Charles, even in the days when Charles was having disputes in his the earlier aspect of his reign, he used the House of Lords and often praised them, encouraged them, and sort of dismissed the Commons, because I think he realised that he couldn't alienate both. I think this is again another ploy to try and bring the support of the Lords in to scupper things. But he did in the end have a very good point in what he was saying, that he stood more for the liberties of the people than anyone in that court, because he was in his eyes, he was the last bastion of that old legal authority. The House of Lords has been put to one side. The Church of England has been, the bishops have been excluded. You've got a huge portion of MPs that have been excluded. So really, the king is the last legitimate link from the past.
Yeah, when you frame it in such a way, Mark, it does sound like it was a hugely revolutionary decision by the Rump to go for this. No precedent whatsoever. And I suppose had Charles accepted the authority of the court, precedent would have been set and caused lots of trouble for his descendants.
That exactly it, yes, and it was all about precedents. The commissioners and MPs were scouring history to look for precedents. One of the things that they touched on was Mary, Queen of Scots. They were saying in Scotland they have precedent of removing kings from the throne. So anointed kings are removed, if they go against their people or the will of the people. But obviously they couldn't use that in England because it was unprecedented. And the other unprecedented side of this is trying Charles for treason. Again, that totally turns on its head what treason is, that he can actually be declared guilty of being a traitor to the people.
The other risk, notwithstanding the trial itself, is it was a public trial, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
So
Public.
so why did they choose to go down that road? Because again, as I think the transcript became a bit of a bestseller, and the court proceedings were pored over by many people.
That's right, yeah. So the trial was public. I mean, it was heavily guarded. London, in itself was in lockdown. They were relatively secure. But I think what they wanted was that extra legitimacy. Perhaps there was an argument from moderates to say, what are we replacing the government with here? What will happen if Charles is removed? So I think that the trial itself perhaps would appease, and ensure that they're not out there to just murder him, which Charles at many points thought that would happen. They're out there to publicly try and remove / execute the king.
It's extraordinary, really, because had they done it behind closed doors, it really would have looked like even more of a stitch up than it really was. What were the people of London? Do we know what they were thinking? Was there support for the king? Because London was a parliamentarian city, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. It had always been a parliamentarian city, and if it wasn't for London, it's doubtful whether Parliament could have fought the war for so long. It was just that financial base. But I mean, that's London itself. The people themselves, I think it's marked by a silence, and it's a deafening silence. So I think by that point, I think people were perhaps shocked at what it had come to. They were waiting to see what would happen. There was some intrigue about, what might happen. Hope, I think, as well. Hope that finally a resolution might be found, and surely they will not go through with any threat to the king, but it may just get both parties to a point where some sort of stable government can come out of this. And I think the other risk, the other thing here is any sympathy for the king would be foolish, because at this point he's been defeated militarily twice. So people would think twice about how futile would it be to try some sort of uprising, or anything like that hasn't got a major sponsor. So I think for Parliament, probably I think they felt that the biggest threat to them wouldn't come from royalists or the a popular revolt in the city. It would probably come from the likes of Denmark, Holland, France, or a foreign country, or even the Scots again. So I think they were very much thinking, well, if we do this in public, we can't be accused by these powers of some sort of underhand murder.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the characters involved in the trial. And I was reading about John Bradshaw, who I think ultimately was the court president for the trial. And right. I was reading that his wife was to be a fly on the wall when that was happening. She was telling him, you shouldn't be the court president, because you'll then a marked man to all royalists, because you're going to be the one overseeing a trial that could ultimately end up in a conviction and therefore the death of the king. And poor old Bradshaw, did he originally say no?
He did, yeah. So originally said no, then reconsidered. Probably that's when he earned the tirade from Mrs. Bradshaw. I mean, he's a 46-year-old. He's from minor gentry. He's Chief Justice of Cheshire for around 2 years at that point. So he's a very minor official in the legal world. But he is unquestionably a devout radical who has strong principles. He's not going to flinch from whatever that court decide to go with. So really, he's ideal for the job. you've got all of the legal leaders who have distanced themselves or either refused to take part.
Yes, it's the elite of the legal establishment. Typical lawyers. Apologies to any lawyers listening, but they immediately back out, don't they? They see things are going to get a little bit spicy, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about it, it's almost like a pride's purge of the legal profession in a way, but without soldiers. They've all just self-purged and gone, and left just that rump in the legal arm, and Bradshaw's picked. So yeah,
and they were right to. We should point out, because the listeners may well know about the Act of Oblivion, which I don't know where was. I'm assuming Bradshaw's wife, Mrs. Bradshaw, was absolutely right, and Bradshaw was one of those men included in the Act of Oblivion.
Yeah, I mean, Bradshaw had died by the time of the Restoration.
Well, that's a lucky escape.
Yeah, but I mean, what his wife could be thinking here is, for example, the Leveller leader Thomas Rainsborough, he was targeted by royalists. So even after the war had finished, during the 1648 uprisings, the royalists re-established themselves in Pontefract Castle. Rainsborough, mistrusted by Fairfax and Cromwell and the grandees because he is very much anti-Charles, wanting a trial. They send him up to deal with that insurrection. And it's during that time when he is in Yorkshire, he's waiting for the royalists to capitulate. The royalist agents, or at least assassins, arrive at his house, pretend that they've got a message from Cromwell. They are let into his bedroom and they stab him to death. So Mrs. Bradshaw really knows what could befall her husband and the family, if he is associated as a leading opponent of the king to this degree, responsible for his trial and execution. That is putting a target on his head, and that's probably why he wore a metal a metal hat with felt padding. So at the trial, perhaps his wife had said, "Okay, if you're going to do it, at least dress the part."
And that was to stop any physical attacks on him. Wow.
Yeah.
Mrs. Bradshaw was. I've got a lot of sympathy for Mrs. Bradshaw. I'm a fan of hers. Cromwell, what was Cromwell's behaviour during the trial? Because, as you say, he's sounding rather Machiavellian.
Yeah, I said earlier that a lot of the time Cromwell was either absent or he didn't document, or potentially what he did document was under an alias name. So you can't necessarily say it's definitely him. But during the trial, I think that was one point when Cromwell couldn't avoid declaring his intentions or becoming that leader to see something through, something as divisive as this through. And I do believe that it's down to Cromwell that the trial and the execution succeeded, because by that point, General Fairfax was in open disagreement of execution, and was actually working to try and get a last-minute reprieve by in time for the king. So really, when you think about it, who have you got left? If you take Fairfax away, you've got his extremely capable second-in-command, Cromwell, who is de facto head of the army. It's the army that are maintaining control. It's the army that have stopped the post. It's the army that are blocking the streets to stop movement. It's the army guarding Charles. It's the army that have got complete control, and Cromwell, as second in command, is ultimately at the head. Bradshaw, as Lord President of the court, doesn't have any power as such. He's just there as the face of the court. He has a grand title. He's given decent lodgings and a guard to follow him around. But in the scheme of government, in the scheme of the army, he doesn't have command. So it needs somebody that's respected and strong enough carry this.
Now, so how did the court? So we've talked about the trial, and we've talked about Charles's effective defence, i.e., not even acknowledging the court. How did the prosecution deal with that, and how did they reach their verdict, the ultimate verdict of guilty?
So, what Charles was doing is he was avoiding pleading, and Bradshaw gradually lost patience. To the point where he's interrupting the king. There's a bit of a verbal contest between them. Charles gets across some very key messages. As I said before, he's able to get some propaganda points across to say, I am the last bastion of legality. If this force can do this to me, what can any person in England call their own? How safe is anybody if they can do this to me? I am standing up for the laws, the established church. So he's really pinning his colours to the mast. And the prosecution, in the end, they try and wear Charles down. That isn't going to work. They then explore evidence, to try and say that Charles was involved in the battles and the killings. In the end, they just proceed to sentence. So again, they decide that a lack of a plea is almost a guilty plea in itself, and they proceed to sentence. And that catches Charles off balance. I think at that point, there's a lot of stuttering. Now, Charles did have a stammer throughout his life, but there's eyewitness accounts to say that during that trial, considering the difficulties of it, the challenges, he spoke impeccably. And it was at the point when Bradshaw pronounced the sentence that Charles starts to panic a little bit and say, hang on, can I be heard? And they cut him off and say, nope, you've had your chance. We've now pronounced sentence. You can't be heard. And, he's saying, by your favour, sir, and then he's escorted out. He leaves a letter which they don't read. He's got nothing else that he can rely on, but perhaps he's looking for time. He's looking for extra support. At one point during the proceedings, you asked, about Cromwell's role. So at one point during the proceedings, Charles says, please, can I be heard? He's arguing with Bradshaw and saying, let me be heard before Parliament. I've got a letter here. And John Downes, one of the commissioners, stands up and says, have we got hearts of stone? And at that point, the commissioners adjourn. Downes is put in his place, really, by Cromwell, saying, we're at this point in proceedings that there's no going back. That's it. And the court proceeds, as I said, to judgment.
And another thing that we probably should mention is Charles, quite early on, actually, doesn't he tap his cane against the prosecution lawyer?
He does, yeah. So this is very early on when John Cook starts to speak. Charles taps his shoulder to stop him. The silver head of his cane drops off and rolls to the floor. And it's such a symbolic moment at that point that Charles, in his chair, is waiting for somebody to retrieve it. The court comes to a halt, but I think everybody's waiting to see what actually is going to happen here. And in the end, Charles stoops, picks the silver head up, and Cook continues.
You're absolutely right that that's symbolic, because that, to me, I know it's early on in the trial, but that to me almost, and we only know that because we know of subsequent events, of course, but that moment seems to me to be when they watch the king have to pick up a piece of kit off the floor, which he'd probably never done in his life. And then the fact that it's, the head of the cane is falling off, that is when you can look at that and see it as the moment when it's going to be all over for him.
Yeah, it's a good point, actually, isn't it? You're considering the head of the cane has come off, and they're going to cut the king's head off.
Indeed. So, Bart, we've talked a long time, and I'd planned to do the trial and the execution in one go, but I think we've come to the end of this episode, but can you come back and we'll talk about the execution, and I'll make this
I'd love to.
a two-parter.
Yeah, that would be brilliant. Yeah.
Now, we continue the chat with Mark on Tuesday with the execution that took place on the 30th of January, 1649. Do subscribe, you'll get that automatically. I hope you enjoyed our chat. Thank you and good night.